Returning home late that night, I was unprepared for the scene that awaited me. The soft glow emanating from the living room caught my attention. Strange for such an hour, especially on a Tuesday. The house was otherwise silent, interrupted only by a faint rustling sound. Confused, I quietly made my way through the entryway toward the source of the noise, where the dim light revealed a figure hunched over the dining table. As I drew closer, I recognized her. My stepmother was bent over piles of papers, her face hidden in her hands. The chaotic state of the table struck me as unusual. Papers were scattered everywhere, some crumpled as if Shed attempted to organize them but had given up in frustration. This was not the version of her I was accustomed to. She usually maintained a composed demeanor, with every aspect of her day carefully orchestrated. This was something else entirely. She appeared exhausted and defeated. Clearly, something had gone awry. But what could it possibly be? "Are you okay?" I asked hesitantly, still lingering in the hallway. My voice seemed to startle her, and she looked up, her eyes rimmed with red, exhaustion etched across her features. She blinked as if surprised to see anyone there, let alone me. After a brief pause, she managed a smile, though it was weak and failed to conceal her discomfort. "Just family issues. You know how it is," she murmured, barely making eye contact before returning her gaze to the documents, dismissing the conversation. Yet, I sensed this wasn't just a typical family problem. There was a deeper issue lurking in the air between us, like a silent storm gathering strength. I took a step closer, drawn in by her sadness. "Do you want to talk about it?" The words slipped out before I could hold them back. It was unsettling to see her so vulnerable, someone who typically exuded strength. For a moment, she sat in silence, staring at the papers, her expression distant. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and controlled. "Your father and we've been having some complications." She paused, absently tracing a line on one of the documents with her fingers. "Things aren't always as straightforward as they seem, are they?" I struggled to find a response. Her words struck a chord within me. I had sensed an undercurrent of tension between them, but it had always been subtle, like something simmering beneath the surface. Seeing her like this, weary and uncertain, made me realize just how serious the situation had become. I nodded slowly, unsure of what else to say. A heavy silence enveloped us until she finally met my gaze. There was something in her eyes I couldn't quite decipher, something deeper than the typical sadness associated with marital issues. It felt like she was searching for something, perhaps an answer, or simply someone who could understand her pain. She began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "We just don't know who we can lean on. Sometimes, even the people closest to us aren't there when we need them." She held my gaze, and for a moment, I felt the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. It was a strange sensation to be confided in, as if I were her lifeline, if only for an instant. I wanted to console her, to say something that might ease the hurt written on her face, but nothing came. Instead, we sat in silence, each trapped in our own thoughts. The next evening, the image of her remained etched in my mind. I had never seen her so exposed, so engulfed in her own suffering. The memory lingered, like an unfinished thought that wouldn't fade away. When night fell, I felt an urge to check in on her. Maybe I could do something, even if it was just to listen. The house was quiet once more when I returned, but this time I didn't hesitate. I walked down the hall and knocked gently on her door. "Come in," she said, her voice barely audible through the door, yet I heard it clearly. She was sitting by the window, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlight outside. When I entered, she looked up, a faint, weary smile appearing on her lips. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her tone gentle, almost teasing. I shook my head, feeling suddenly awkward under her gaze. "No, not really. I just wanted to check on you." She motioned for me to take a seat, and I crossed the room to settle on the edge of her bed. "It's thoughtful of you to check in," she said, her voice soft and genuine. "You didn't have to." "I know," I replied, perhaps too quickly. I just thought you seemed like you could use someone to talk to for a little while. She didn't answer right away, instead staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. Then, with a deep sigh, she turned back to me. I suppose you're right. It's been tough these last few months. I didn't realize how much I was keeping to myself until last night. Our conversation felt strangely intimate, as if we were sharing a secret meant for no one else. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. As I sat there, I became acutely aware of how close we were. Her hand rested on the bed, just inches from mine. I know it's not easy, I said, carefully choosing my words. But maybe talking about it would help, even if just a little. Her eyes softened, and she nodded slightly. You're a good listener, she murmured. Thank you for that. We fell into silence for a moment, the stillness stretching between us until I could no longer resist the urge to reach out. My hand moved instinctively, resting gently over hers, as if to convey my presence and let her know she wasn't alone. She glanced down at our hands, her eyes darkening slightly, and for a tense moment, I questioned whether I'd crossed a line. But to my surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up, her gaze meeting mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. I don't know if I should be saying this, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. But it's been so long since anyone's just been here for me. Her words hung heavily in the air, and I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion I couldn't quite define. We were both frozen in that moment, unable to break the spell. But then, as if pulled by an invisible force, she leaned forward, bringing her face closer to mine. My heart raced, and my thoughts swirled chaotically. Before I could fully comprehend what was happening, our lips met in a soft, hesitant kiss. It was fleeting, gentle, like a question neither of us was ready to answer. I pulled away, startled by the unexpected moment. Her wide eyes mirrored my surprise, and for an instant, I worried I had crossed an unbridgeable boundary. But she didn't withdraw. Instead, she remained seated, her gaze searching mine as if trying to understand the whirlwind of emotions that had just erupted. We shouldn't, I began, my voice trembling with uncertainty. I know, she replied, her tone laced with quiet sorrow. I understand this is complicated, but I can't bear to feel alone any longer. Her confession struck a chord within me, compelling me to lean forward again, resting my forehead against hers. I could feel the warmth of her breath, slightly shaky against my skin, and the intimacy of the moment was nearly overwhelming. We remained in that fragile space, both hesitant to make a move, as if the slightest misstep might shatter the connection we had just forged. After what felt like an eternity, she pulled back, her expression caught between regret and longing. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't intend for this to happen. It's all right, I said softly, though I wasn't entirely convinced of that myself. It's not your fault. A heavy silence descended upon us, both of us acutely aware that we had crossed a line, yet neither of us knew how to retreat from it. The weight of the moment felt nearly unbearable, and for the first time, I was left feeling genuinely conflicted. As I stood to leave, she looked up at me, her expression unreadable. Thank you, she murmured, her voice soft, for being here, for everything. I nodded slightly, unable to find the right words, and turned toward the door. It hit me then that our relationship had shifted irrevocably. The next evening, I found myself hesitating outside her door once more, aware of the lingering tension in the air. Everything felt different, more precarious. Yet that same pull persisted, urging me to check in on her, hoping we could talk things out and restore some sense of normalcy, whatever that might look like now. Taking a deep breath, I knocked gently. This time, there was no immediate reply, just the faint sound of a familiar song drifting through the door. I slowly pushed it open, unsure of what I might find. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her bed, engrossed in something with a look of nostalgia on her face. It took me a moment to recognize the small, tattered album resting in her lap, an old keepsake I hadn't seen in years. Is that? I began, pausing in my tracks as she looked up, surprise flooding her features. A slight blush crept onto her cheeks when she noticed me, but she didn't shut the album. Instead, she nodded, patting the space next to her on the floor as if inviting me to join her. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly, glancing back at the well-worn pages. I stumbled upon this while clearing out some boxes and didn't realize how many memories were tucked away in here. I felt warmth spread across my face as I caught sight of the open page, featuring a snapshot of me grinning widely, gaps where my baby teeth had once been and my hair a chaotic mess. The goofy poses and silly expressions were nearly unrecognizable, but seeing them again brought a rush of nostalgia that swept over me. "No, it's perfectly fine," I replied, moving closer to sit beside her. "I didn't even know we still had that album." She smiled, her eyes lingering on the images as she turned the page. "You were such a joyful kid," she remarked, a warmth in her tone that I seldom heard. "I can see it in your eyes, the way you looked at the world around you." I chuckled, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Yeah, I was probably just thrilled about something simple, like a new toy or dessert." She shook her head, still focused on the photographs. "No, it was more than that," she insisted. "There was a lightness, a kind of hope." She paused, then looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. "I think you still possess it. You just might not realize it." Her words struck me unexpectedly, and for a brief moment we fell silent, both of us peering down at the open pages as if searching for hidden answers among the old photographs. I hadn't considered those days in so long. I hadn't truly understood their significance until now, seeing them through her perspective. Just then, she turned the page, unveiling a photo I hadn't encountered in years. It showed me around 7 or 8 years old, proudly holding a model airplane I had built from a kit. I vividly recalled that day, the excitement and pride of having completed something all by myself. "You were so proud," she whispered. When I glanced at her, she wore a smile, although her eyes glistened as if lost in the memories. She turned to me, her gaze steady. In that instant, I became acutely aware of our proximity. The moment unfolded so naturally that I nearly didn't register it. 1 second, we were exchanging glances, and the next, she leaned closer. A palpable pause enveloped us, her face so close I could see the faintest flicker of worry in her eyes, a hesitation that made my heart race. Then, just as gently, our lips met in a fleeting, tentative kiss. There was a softness to it, an unspoken understanding that neither of us fully grasped. It felt delicate, almost like a silent agreement, a shared moment that transcended words. I pulled back, a flood of conflicting emotions washing over me, unsure of how to respond. She appeared equally lost. Her gaze dropped back to the album, her fingers tracing the pages as if searching for something to anchor her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely a murmur. "I didn't mean to. I don't know what came over me." "It's all right," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. "It's just, I don't know." I glanced down, avoiding her eyes as I tried to untangle the knot of emotions swirling within me. She reached out, placing her hand over mine. The warmth of her touch steadied me in that moment. "I think we're both just seeking something familiar," she said quietly. "Something that makes sense. Sometimes memories have a way of drawing us in, even when we don't intend for them to." Her words hung in the air, and I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I understood what she meant. As I sat there with her, the world around us seemed to fade away, as if we had entered a long-forgotten chapter of our lives, something buried beneath the weight of daily routines and responsibilities. For a long moment, we lingered in silence, each absorbed in our thoughts, the photo album resting between us like a delicate bridge to the past. Eventually, she closed the album with a small, almost wistful sigh. "We probably shouldn't be doing this," she finally said, her voice steady yet tinged with a sadness I hadn't heard before. "I've been feeling so disconnected lately from everything." She glanced away, a hint of shame in her posture, but the vulnerability in her voice compelled me to stay. "I get it," I replied softly. "Life can feel overwhelming sometimes. Maybe we both just want to feel less alone." She looked at me then, her gaze gentle and contemplative. Maybe, she murmured, her hand still resting over mine, a small comfort in the stillness of the room. As the moment passed, she gradually withdrew her hand, casting one last glance at the album before closing it. I should put this away, she said, attempting to lighten the mood. I nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of loss as she stood to return the album to its box, as if she were packing away the memories we had just shared. When she turned back to me, the distance that had briefly disappeared seemed to reestablish itself. Yet something unspoken hung in the air, a connection that couldn't be undone. Thanks for letting me relive those memories, I said, managing a small smile as I prepared to leave. She smiled back, a flicker of warmth in her eyes that eased the ache within me. Thank you for sharing them with me, she replied gently as I stepped out of her room. The weight of what had just happened settled on my shoulders, a clear indication that our relationship had shifted in ways I couldn't yet grasp. The following days flew by in a blur, filled with classes and assignments, yet my thoughts always drifted back to her. No matter how hard I tried to focus, I found myself reminiscing about our quiet conversations, that tender kiss, and her eyes brimming with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. A few evenings later, I returned home late. The cool night air clung to me as I entered the house, shaking off the autumn chill. The lights were dim, and everything felt serene. I assumed everyone was asleep, but as I passed the living room, I spotted her sitting alone on the couch, her head reclined back, lost in thought. At first, she didn't notice me, and I contemplated slipping past, allowing her this moment of peace. But I couldn't resist the urge to check in. I needed to know if everything was still okay between us, if the delicate connection we had forged still lingered. Hey, I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before quickly being replaced by a weary smile. Oh, hey, she replied, straightening slightly and brushing back a stray lock of hair. You're home late. Yeah, had a lot to catch up on, I answered, feeling awkward and unsure. I glanced around, noticing the empty glass on the table beside her and the blanket draped over her lap. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just saw you sitting here and thought maybe. She shook her head, dismissing my concern. No, it's fine. I was just thinking. Sometimes it's hard to sleep, you know? I nodded and moved a little closer, leaning against the arm of the couch. We sat together in silence, the only sounds the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of a clock. I sensed that something was weighing on her mind, something she hadn't yet voiced. Are you okay? I finally asked, choosing my words with care. I mean, I know things haven't been easy lately. She let out a soft sigh, her eyes drifting down to her hands clasped in her lap. A lot has been changing, and I guess I'm just not sure where I fit in anymore, she murmured. Sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions, like life is happening around me, but I'm not really part of it. Her words resonated with me in a way I hadn't anticipated, echoing my own quiet fears and uncertainties. I had been so absorbed in my own life, my studies, my future, that I hadn't paused to consider the challenges she might be facing. I know it's not the same, I began, carefully selecting my words, but I understand that feeling of just watching everything unfold, trying to keep pace but never really feeling present. It's like life is a current, and we're just drifting along. She looked at me, her expression softening, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that took my breath away. You really do understand, don't you? She whispered almost to herself, caught off guard by the realization. I reached out, my hand brushing against hers, and hesitated, nearly pulling back. But then her fingers wrapped around mine, warm and steady. A simple gesture that felt more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. Sometimes, she said softly, I wish I could pause everything, just for a moment, to feel like I truly belong somewhere. Her words hung between us, and for a heartbeat, everything else faded away. I found myself leaning in, drawn by an unspoken force, and as I did, she looked up, her gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity. The moment unfolded so naturally that I barely noticed it happening until our faces were close enough that I could feel her breath against my skin. Neither of us moved, frozen in that instant, each waiting for the other to retreat. But instead, she closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt tentative yet certain. It wasn't like before. This time, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just a mutual understanding that we were both seeking something, even if neither of us knew precisely what that was. It was a fleeting moment, a brief connection that felt both strangely familiar and entirely new, as if we were rediscovering one another for the first time. When we finally drew apart, the silence that settled between us was thick, laden with unasked questions that neither of us felt ready to confront. She lowered her gaze, her fingers still loosely entwined with mine, and I sensed a slight tremor in her hand, a subtle reminder of the boundary we had just crossed. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You don't need to say anything," I replied, even as my own voice wavered. My heart raced, thoughts swirling chaotically as I struggled to make sense of what had just occurred. Part of me ached to say more, to reach out and find a way to reassure her, but the words eluded me. Slowly, she withdrew her hand, her expression a blend of sadness and confusion. "I don't know what this means for us," she murmured, almost to herself. "I can't figure any of this out." I was equally lost. Yet, despite the swirling uncertainty, I couldn't help but feel that I didn't regret what had happened. There was a peculiar comfort in our shared silence, an unspoken understanding that things had changed, even if we weren't sure what that change entailed. After a moment, she let out a soft sigh, her gaze wandering to the window. "Maybe we shouldn't overthink it," she suggested quietly. "Perhaps we should just take things one day at a time and see where it leads." I nodded, though I was unsure if I believed that approach. Her words felt like a lifeline, yet they also terrified me, as if they carried a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. As I stood to leave, she looked up at me, her expression inscrutable. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "For being here, for listening." I managed a small nod, unable to articulate how I felt. I knew that our relationship had transformed, that whatever bond we shared had deepened in ways I could no longer ignore. Yet, as I left the room, I felt a confusing mix of relief and melancholy, as though something precious had slipped through my fingers. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding moments alone with her, not out of desire, but from uncertainty about what to do next. Each time I caught sight of her around the house, my thoughts spiraled back to that night in the living room. The way she had gazed at me, the warmth of her hand in mine, and that brief, unexpected kiss that reverberated in my memory. I replayed the moment countless times, searching for some kind of clarity, but all I uncovered was the same blend of yearning and confusion. One night, I returned home later than usual, hoping everyone would be asleep. But as I stepped inside, I found her standing in the kitchen, filling a glass with water. Our eyes locked, and for a heartbeat, we froze, caught in a moment suspended in time. "Can't sleep?" I asked, breaking the silence, my heart pounding in my chest. She shook her head, a faint smile flickering across her face. "No, just lost in thought, I guess." "Same here," I admitted, taking a step closer. The soft kitchen light cast gentle shadows around us, and the atmosphere felt charged, as if the entire house was holding its breath. An unspoken tension settled between us, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't seem to ignore. I yearned to say something, anything, to bridge the growing divide. But every time I opened my mouth, the words slipped away. She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "It's strange, isn't it? How silence can convey so much even when we don't want it to." Her observation hung in the air, and I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "Yeah," I replied softly, sliding onto a stool at the kitchen counter. "Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words ever could." She sat across from me, and we fell into that familiar quiet once more, each of us adrift in our own thoughts. I could feel the tension mounting, a subtle pressure that thickened with each passing moment. It was as if the space between us had both shrunk and expanded, filled with all the things we hadn't said. "Do you ever wonder if—" she began, then hesitated, her gaze fixed on her hands. "Do you ever think that some things are just meant to happen, no matter how much we try to avoid them?" Her question caught me off guard, stirring up a familiar unease. I wasn't quite sure how to respond, but I knew I needed to be honest. "Maybe," I replied, my voice a mere whisper. "Perhaps some things are destined to unfold, even if we can't make sense of them." She nodded slowly, and for a moment, I thought she might say more, but instead, she simply looked at me, her expression unreadable. A sudden, intense urge surged within me to close the gap that lay between us. Before I could stop myself, I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers. She didn't pull away, and the warmth of her skin felt almost overwhelming. I sensed a slight tremor in her hand, reflecting the uncertainty I was grappling with inside. "I don't know where this leaves us," I admitted quietly, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what we're supposed to do either," she replied, looking up at me with a steady gaze. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Maybe we're not meant to have all the answers," she whispered, a sadness lacing her words that I hadn't heard before. "Maybe we're just meant to exist in this moment, without trying to figure it all out." Her sentiment resonated deeply within me, providing a strange sense of relief, as if the pressure building between us had finally found an escape. We remained in that position, hands still connected, and for the first time, I allowed myself to simply be present, without overthinking or questioning our situation. After a while, she let out a soft sigh, and I could see the weariness etched in her features. "It's been a long time since I felt like I could truly be myself with anyone," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the window. "I think that's why this feels so complicated." I tightened my grip on her hand, offering the comfort I could provide. "You don't have to put on a facade with me," I reassured her, my voice steady. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her expression softened, and she offered a faint smile, one that conveyed both gratitude and a hint of sorrow. "Thank you," she said, and the sincerity in her tone sent a wave of warmth through me, anchoring me in the moment. The silence that followed felt different, more settled, as if we had both reached a quiet understanding. We sat together for what felt like an eternity, each lost in our own thoughts, until she finally broke the stillness. "I don't want to complicate things for you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to be the reason you feel torn." "You're not," I replied, the words spilling out before I could think them through. "You're the reason I feel like I can be honest with myself, even when it's confusing. You've shown me parts of myself I didn't even know existed." She seemed surprised, her gaze dropping to our hands intertwined on the table. I could see the conflict within her, the tension between her desires and what she felt was expected of her. "We can't keep doing this," she murmured, almost to herself, but the hesitation in her voice tugged at my heart. "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure I truly meant it. "But right now this feels right." For a moment, we simply held each other's gaze, the silence thick with unspoken thoughts. Then, as if drawn together by an unseen force, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a brief moment, yet it left me feeling both grounded and disoriented. When we pulled away, we exchanged a look that communicated so much, each of us acknowledging the complexity of our situation without needing to articulate it. She stood up slowly, her hand slipping from mine, and I felt a sharp pang of loss as she turned toward the doorway. "Maybe we should take a step back," she suggested, her voice shaky. "Maybe that's what we need right now." I nodded, even though every fiber of my being wanted to argue. "Yeah, maybe you're right." As she left the room, I was left alone, the warmth of her presence fading and the ache of unresolved emotions settling heavily on my chest. In the following days, my life became a whirlwind of shallow interactions and unasked questions that I buried deep inside. I immersed myself in my studies, staying out late to avoid returning home, hoping that time would ease the burden of what had transpired. But the memory clung to me, a haunting melody that echoed in my thoughts. I found myself constantly checking the clock, counting the minutes until I had to face her again. When I eventually returned home one night, I hoped the house would be dark and quiet. Instead, I noticed a soft light glowing from the kitchen. She was there, sitting at the table, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt an undeniable shift. Her expression was guarded, weary, as if she had been carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier each day. I considered turning back, pretending I hadn't seen her, but she motioned for me to join her, her gaze unwavering. I crossed the room and took a seat across from her, my heart racing in the stillness. At first, she remained silent, her eyes scanning the table as if searching for the right words. Finally, she drew a deep breath, her gaze meeting mine, filled with a mix of determination and regret. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about everything, about us." The weight of her words settled over me, and I felt a rush of fear constricting my chest. I wanted to respond, to say something that would relieve the tension, but I found myself at a complete loss for words. All I could do was wait, holding my breath and hoping she wouldn't say anything that might shatter the delicate bond we had created. "I can't keep doing this," she confessed, her voice trembling. "As much as it feels right in those moments, it's tearing me apart." My heart sank at her words, a hollow ache forming in my chest. "I know it's complicated," I said softly, trying to maintain my composure, "but I don't regret a single moment of it." She looked down, tracing an invisible line on the table with her fingers, as if attempting to make sense of the tangled emotions that swirled between us. "Neither do I," she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. "But it's not that simple. I can't ignore what this is doing to me. To us. I feel like I'm losing myself in something I don't fully understand." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and final, and I felt a surge of desperation rise within me. "We don't have to have all the answers," I replied, my voice urgent but calm. "Maybe we can just take it one day at a time. Let it be what it is." She shook her head, her expression filled with pain. "I wish it were that easy. I wish I could push everything else aside and just be here with you. But every time I think I can, I remember the consequences and the impact it could have. I'm supposed to be the responsible one, the one who keeps everything in line." I instinctively reached across the table, my hand covering hers, a gesture that felt both natural and necessary. "We don't need to sort it all out right now," I said gently. "I just don't want to lose this, whatever it is between us. I don't want to lose you." Her gaze met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimmer of hope, as if there might be a path through this tangled mess. But just as quickly, that flicker faded, replaced by resignation. She withdrew her hand slowly, her eyes drifting to the window where the soft glow of streetlights painted shadows across the room. "Maybe the best thing we can do is let go," she murmured, her voice filled with a sorrow that made my heart ache. "Maybe that's the only way for either of us to move forward." Her words struck me like a punch to the gut, and I felt as if I were teetering on the brink of an abyss. I wanted to protest, to tell her that we could find a way to make it work, but deep down I knew she was right. We had crossed a line, and there was no turning back to what we once had. I stood up, feeling a hollow emptiness settle over me, and she looked up, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I never wanted it to end like this." "Neither did I," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "But maybe this is for the best." She nodded, though her eyes shimmered with sadness that mirrored my own. We stood there, both suspended in a moment of quiet finality, as if we were bidding farewell to something that had never fully existed. I turned to leave, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. But just as I reached the door, I heard her voice, soft and filled with an emotion that stopped me in my tracks. "Wait!" I turned back, and for a moment, she simply studied me, as though trying to memorize every detail of my face. "No matter what happens," she said quietly, "I want you to know that you mattered to me more than I can express." Her confession hung in the air, filling the space between us with an ache that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. I longed to respond, to convey how deeply she had changed my life in ways I couldn't fully articulate. But the words escaped me, leaving me with only a nod, hoping she understood the weight of my feelings. As I stepped out into the cool night air, her words echoed in my mind, a poignant reminder of the moments we shared and the unspoken truths that lingered between us. As I walked away from the house, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as if I had left a part of myself behind. Yet, even as the distance grew between us, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. There were too many unresolved questions and unexpressed emotions suspended in the air. As I made my way down the empty street, I found myself wondering if fate would one day reunite us, if our paths would cross again in an unexpected way. But for now, all I had were the memories. The stolen moments, the quiet confessions, the unfulfilled promises that would remain etched in my heart. Looking back at the house, with a faint glow still visible in the window, I felt a bittersweet pang, a mixture of hope and regret that would linger long after that night faded into memory.